Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of Oversimplified's World War II. As always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below. Please consider going over to Oversimplified and showing him a little bit of love. If you like what you see here, we do want to encourage our original content creators to continue making educational videos for the rest of us to watch and enjoy. Alright, so we're going to be picking up where we left off with part 1, and this is part 2, and it's the final section of Oversimplified's World War II. We will follow this up next week, probably with the Cold War. I should add right here at the beginning that I am not a military historian. My degree is in global history. It includes study of global conflicts. So I did take mandatory classes in both World War I and World War II. At both the undergraduate and graduate level, but military history has never been a major area of interest for me. So in both of those examples, I tended to gravitate towards things that do interest me, which is things like famine. So like the Siege of Leningrad, I know a lot about. The logistics of getting food in there and the effects it had on the citizens and all that. I can talk for hours on that, but military tactics, the type of weaponry used, I'm not very strong on. The broad picture, yeah, I got all that from my classes. I mostly tried to zero in on the things that interested me, which was migration patterns, immigration caused by the war, the famines, the diseases, things like that. That's kind of my cup of tea area. Anyway, let's just get into this, and as always, I will add as much as I can with the disclaimer I just made, that I don't know a lot about the military aspects. I will also, as I did in the first video, share some primary sources discussing this war, or from this war, discussing one particular topic, why Japan surrenders. So that's foreshadowing to what we'll be talking about with primary sources.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community. Stick around until the end of the video to learn how you can get an exclusive deal just for Oversimplified viewers.
Sounds good.
So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth...
Yeah, so Britain has a lot of Commonwealths, a lot of allies. So they're not alone. They've got Canada, New Zealand, Australia, a lot of other places, as you can see here on the map. Places that were former territories, former colonies, are still part of the kingdom in some cases, Commonwealths and so on.
Nations and other allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns.
Right.
On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Defensive Tripartite Pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really bad.
Yeah, so the initial attacks on Greece went very badly for the Tripartite Pact, Italy especially. They just failed spectacularly. There's no other way to put it.
Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And
yeah, and pycrete's still a thing. They're still toying around with potential uses for pycrete.
And he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room.
That particular event probably didn't happen. The evidence for it is sketchy at best. If it did happen, it probably didn't happen at the conference that they're talking about here. If it did happen, it happened at a different conference in London that's totally unrelated to this. But pykrete is a thing. It is wood pulp, wood sawdust, that kind of thing, paper pulp mixed with ice to give it a greater strength than either wood or ice would have by itself. Now, the obvious problem is it's ice. Ice melts. So there are some limits to what you can do with pykrete, but it is extremely hard material that's light and buoyant. It's great if you want to build ships out of it that are hard to damage, but it's ice. What is it? Mythbusters actually tried building a ship out of pykrete and testing it, and it worked quite well at first, but it did eventually start bringing leaks and sinking as the ice melted, as we would expect. When they were discussing it during World War II, however, they were also looking at ways to have refrigeration technology on these ships to keep them cold enough that this wouldn't be as much of an issue. But obviously, there's a lot of problems with this.
Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat.
And Alan Turing's life story is pretty tragic. They recently did a movie on it, and the name of it escapes my head, but the way he was treated after this because of his, let's just say sexual persuasion. I gotta watch you say in YouTube. Caused him a lot of problems, to put it mildly. It's really a tragic story. He deserves a lot better than what he got.
Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city.
And both world wars, the Australians, a lot of the British allies actually, the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Anzac people, Australia, New Zealand, those forces were pivotal in a lot of battles. Those of us living here in the States tend to think of our northern neighbors as super friendly, almost annoyingly polite people. Put them in war, and you see an entirely different side of the Canadians. They are vicious. Historically, they are very vicious troops. The Australians are also, they live in a country where everything's trying to kill you. So I'm pretty sure this is just like a walkabout in the outback. I know I'm just making fun of it. I'm making light of it. It's a serious topic, but the Australian and New Zealand forces are spectacular in war. They contribute a lot. So do the Canadians. And I mentioned last video, even though Poland was conquered pretty early in the war, the Poles continue fighting throughout. Allied with among all the other allied, you have Polish troops that are doing spectacular. The Battle of Britain, Polish troops are pivotal there. Australian, New Zealand troops are pivotal in Africa and some of the southern fighting in that region, as well as over in places like Greece and the Middle East, especially in World War I, but also here in World War II. So yeah, these countries all contributed in big ways,
disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out.
Barbarossa.
With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put...
Yeah, so let's talk about this real quick. I told you that the one area about World War II that I know about a decent amount is Leningrad, because, again, famine is one of my areas that I focus on a lot. And I've read a lot of the diaries and journals from the people who were in Leningrad, not only during the siege, but a lot of them, their diaries and journals began before the siege. So you can see the build, what's happening from throughout Barbarossa up until the siege and then through the siege. And one thing that I found kind of amusing about this period is that there's several references in Soviet journals in Leningrad, but also throughout the Soviet Union during this time that referenced this quote, and I don't remember the exact phrasing, sorry, that went something along the lines of, the Soviet soldiers are victorious, but the Germans are advancing. And it was a sarcastic joke. A lot of the Soviet jokes were dry and sarcastic. This is no exception. What they were referring to was the propaganda, because they would have these announcements being made. The Soviet troops are victorious over the Germans here, and they're victorious over the Germans there, and we have defeated the Germans here. They're getting all these announcements, but they also notice that each subsequent announcement where they're saying, we had a victory here, the next victory is further inland into the Soviet Union. So we're winning all these battles, but somehow the Germans are moving deeper and deeper into our territory. They were laughing at the math there and laughing in a very sarcastic way. We're winning, but somehow the Germans are still invading our territory rapidly and gaining land even though we're winning every battle. So that's just an interesting aspect of this initial stage of Barbarossa. The Soviet Union, the government propaganda is portraying all these victories. The Soviet people aren't fooled. They're not idiots. They recognize that even though they'll be told they're winning battle after battle, it's clear the Germans are getting deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. Let's go back just a second here.
Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk.
So yeah, you can see there's this progression. So they know that the propaganda is bovine excrement.
Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion...
Yeah, and we will do one or more videos later on the Siege of Leningrad, because, like I said, I know a lot about that. Not only about what happened in Leningrad with the famine and trying to survive being surrounded by German forces to the south, Finnish forces to the north. Fortunately for Leningrad, the Finnish forces basically secured the territory to the north, but they never actually pushed into Leningrad, and they in fact refused to invade directly, even though the Germans asked them to, because they really they just wanted the territory they lost in the Winter War back. That's all they cared about, really. And they did not want to anger the Soviet Union any more than they had to, because when this is all over, they're still going to be neighbors one way or the other, and they don't need angry neighbors. So they just try to get the territory they lost in the Winter War back, and then just kind of hold their ground. If it wasn't for that, Leningrad might have been much worse than it was. Anyway, I do definitely want to talk about the logistics of getting food into Leningrad and getting survivors out, especially the operations over Lake Ladoga. That's this big blue spot right over here. They actually build a railroad over the lake in the winter on the ice. Just mind-boggling stuff that they pull off in order to keep Leningrad alive.
Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened.
That's not how the Russians work. You can take their capital. They don't care. I mean, they care, but they're not going to surrender because of that. Napoleon found that out the hard way. The angry mustache man is going to find out that Just threatening Moscow is not going to be enough.
Happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep going." But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles.
Yeah, not just in the vehicles. The lubricant used for the guns would freeze, which would cause them to jam. The Soviets understood how to deal with this issue. The Germans, not so much. They just didn't have the experience with the kind of colds that they get in parts of the Soviet Union. So the Russians were prepared. They knew how to deal with it. The Germans didn't. Suddenly, the Soviets have a huge advantage, especially once they bring in troops from Siberia that are trained specifically for fighting in cold climates.
That's fine. Keep going. We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift. Perfectly normal. Keep going. Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials.
So real quickly, we don't talk as much about this region of World War II. But there was a lot of fighting going on in China, Burma, pushing in toward India. In fact, my grandfather served in the China-India-Burma theater. He was part of a cartography unit. They were in charge of updating all the maps that were wildly out of date in this region. Most of the maps that they had been made by the British in the early colonial period. So they were way out of date, and they needed more up-to-date modern information in order to plan how to counter Japanese operations and, well, broader being Axis operations in this part of the war. So we don't talk about this part of the war so much, but there was a lot going on in that area too.
Began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK.
Right.
So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in...
Let's talk about Pearl Harbor real quick. I've been there. I've been to the memorials in Pearl Harbor. I was pretty young at the time. I don't remember a lot about it, other than my grandparents were with me. And I'm bringing that specifically up because December 7th was my grandmother's birthday. And she and her niece, my mother's cousin, told me that they were actually out in a park in LA celebrating my grandmother's birthday when air raid sirens went off and said, and announcements were made to everyone to stay in your homes. The United States is under attack as of December 7th. Stay tuned for breaking news. Until you know more, please try to stay at home. If Hawaii's has been attacked, California is obviously the next obvious target if they're going to continue attacking the United States. So she remembered that quite well. I don't know the details at all. I couldn't get it from anybody. Just a little bit of hints here and there that my grandmother was very close to somebody who was in Pearl Harbor on the day of that attack. Former boyfriend or something like that is the impression that I got from my family. But nobody would go into detail, especially my grandmother. She would not talk about it at all. But I know being there affected her tremendously. I remember that part clearly. Somebody close to her died. He was on board the Arizona and was killed in the attack. And for the rest of her life, she refused to celebrate her birthday. For her, it was a day that somebody close to her died, and it was a day that would live in infamy for her, specifically. She just wanted nothing to do with December 7th for the rest of her life. And it was her birthday, and sending her a birthday card could get you in trouble. Saying happy birthday could get you in trouble.
Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to.
Yeah, he didn't have to because, yes, he had a defensive pact with Japan, but this wasn't a defensive situation. Japan was the aggressor. So Hitler was not obligated to come to Japan's defense. So he did not have to declare war on the U.S. And I'm not really sure why he did, because it was probably not the smartest move.
The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been
Yeah, and that's what I was talking about earlier. We just really don't talk so much about this theater, and I don't know a lot about it. I've been trying to research what my grandfather's unit was doing during this period, but it's so hard to find concrete facts. It really is. It really frustrates me to no end.
Staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals.
Yeah, and notice they say plural. He's talking in a plural there. Famously, we have the Holocaust where he targets the Jews. Huge, unfathomable. Can never say that word. I feel like Megamind when I try to say that. Tragedy, it's horrible. But Jews weren't the only one on Angry Mustache Man's list of people to be exterminated. They were just the target of opportunity. They were there in Germany. They were there in the countries that allied with Germany. They were also there in some of the countries conquered, like Poland especially. He also wanted Slavs exterminated. He wanted gypsies exterminated. He wanted homosexuals exterminated. He had a long list of people who just needed to go away. The Jews just bore the brunt of that because they were right there in easy reach. That's not to belittle what happened to them. I'm not trying to do that by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's also important to understand that he had other targets that he also wanted exterminated. He just never got the opportunity to do that on the scale that he did with the Jews.
In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was...
Yes, but one thing that really bothers me about this whole thing is that a lot of countries shut their borders to Jewish immigrants during this period, including the United States. We turned away a lot of refugees that were trying to get out of these regions. And I don't want to blame these countries for the deaths in the Holocaust. That's all on Germany and their allies that were actually doing the killing. But a lot of those deaths might have been avoided if other countries had been more willing to take in refugees. That's why, no matter how I feel about other aspects of immigration law, and I believe me, I have a lot of opinions. I'm married to an immigrant.
Over, and Hitler
an immigrant who is now a citizen. But when it comes to refugees, every time we turn them away, people die. And that's something we need to remember when we make these decisions. Yes, we got to watch out for number one, ourselves, but we've got to remember the cost of our decisions. And in the case of World War II, when we turned down Jewish immigration, not all of it, but a lot of it, from refugees, we were signing death sentences. We were leaving people to die. And that needs to be part of the discussion when we're talking about immigration policies and where we want to draw our lines and where we want to make our exceptions, like, for example, refugees. That's why there are separate policies for refugees. Anyway, I don't want to get into a political storm here, but this was a missed opportunity to save thousands, if not millions, of lives that was missed. And for me, that's also tragic. And I don't want to blame the country to turn them out, like I said. You got to look out for number one, too. I get that. I do. I really do. But we also got to consider the cost of having these policies and attitudes.
Continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil.
But he got a little sidetracked. It really, what I think, was a battle of egos between Angry Mustache Man number 1 and Angry Mustache Man number 2.
Forces
over
moved
a
across
town
the north
named
with
after
ease, and
number
Hitler
2.
got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which
Yeah, and this is urban warfare. Urban warfare is really, really terrible. You've got, when you're fighting in city streets, you've got cover everywhere. You've got, you're talking three-dimensional terrain. You've got buildings that snipers can be shooting out of. You've got plenty of narrow, confined places for booby traps, for ambushes, plenty of places for troops to hide, to find cover. You've got a lot of citizens that are going to be joining the fight, defending their homes, even though they're not soldiers. It just adds to the chaos. Urban fighting can be horrifyingly bad. And it actually gets worse once you start air bombing some of these cities like Stalingrad. I mean, if you look at this picture here, you see that a lot of these structures are largely torn down. You might think, well, that's removing cover, but no, it's actually helping create cover. But it's also creating obstacles. It makes it harder to move some of your larger units in, like tanks and artillery, because you got all this collapsed buildings and rubble and craters, making the terrain harder to travel. You've got these open structures, which are great for cover. They're great for shelter. They're great for sniping again, even without the structure being intact. You've also got to worry about potentially getting crushed by collapsing buildings. It's terrible, terrible fighting conditions.
Them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east.
They did do
factories
that.
Had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered.
And that's one thing that makes invading the Soviet Union or Russia in general hard, is it's just so vast that no matter how much you take, there's always more to go where they've got factories producing more material. It's not like some of the smaller countries where you can take over their manufacturing pretty quick and easy and hamstring them that way. And in the case of the Soviet Union, they actually, because it takes so long to invade, they actually had time to relocate factories further inland. Impressive what they did, actually.
His new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, no, you stay.
Yeah, and Stalin said the same thing about Stalingrad. Well, in general, but especially Stalingrad. Don't give one single foot. Do not retreat. Do not step back. Famously, then, not one step back. And that's one of the things that's going to make Stalingrad so deadly, is both sides had orders not to retreat, to take that ground at all costs, or to hold it at all costs. And that recipe for bloodbath.
The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually,
I love
they sank a lot
Battleship.
of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. "All right," said the Americans, "we'll do it your way." Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy.
Yeah, and that's one problem with saying you can fix everything. You better be able to deliver on that, or you could be in trouble.
He immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before, invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but
and that's a subject for a video in and of itself, just like Leningrad and some of the other things we talked about, Stalingrad. But Calais is the shortest point across from France to Britain. So it's a logical point to launch such an invasion. And the Allies made sure to set up operations in Calais that would make it look like an invasion was coming from there. They sent one of their most famous generals, Patton. They wanted him out of the way anyway, and this was a great way to do it. They sent him to Calais. They sent some troops, but they also sent a lot of props. Inflatable tanks, inflatable aircrafts, things to make it look like there was a military presence gathering there, even though there really wasn't. All to get Germany's eyes, or the Axis eyes, over here, and not where the real invasion was going to come. It's really a brilliant operation. And I said this in the Cuban Missile Crisis video, both in the video and in some of the discussion afterwards. This kind of deception happened in war all the time. It happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's happening here. It's happened in the American Civil War and every other war. You always have operations where one enemy tries to make the other think they have more than they really do. Soviets famously did this a lot with their missiles, where they would use support actual missiles with dummy missiles to make it look like they had a lot more than they really had. A lot of those parades you see, a lot of the missiles are dummy missiles, just to increase the perception of might, or in this case, to increase the perception that an invasion is coming from somewhere other than it is. There's also been instances, for example, where you would, in a civil war in America, for example, you'd make fake cannons to make it look like there was a defensive position where there wasn't actually one. Things like that.
Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer.
The beaches were not nicer. The beaches were covered by high cliffs that had German pillboxes and other fortifications on them. It's not a nice beach.
Careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge.
Yep.
He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to...
I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard that one. It's pretty famous. It might be apocryphal. I really don't know for sure.
Break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and
that's a good way of portraying it.
with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been knocked out. 1 to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 7th, the...
So we're getting into the, this is kind of the genesis of the Cold War right here. People would debate exactly when it started and all that. But the Allies, the non-Soviet Allies, I should specify, were already looking at the post-war world. That's hard to say real fast. And they saw that the Soviet Union was going to be a threat after this war. If not a military threat, then an ideological threat, an economic threat. So they were making plans on how to deal with the post-war world. And this is where they're going to start looking at things like, well, we can use these nuclear bombs to push Japan into submission, but also as a signal to the Soviet Union that you can't just keep pushing west, that we are going to not let you keep expanding the way you are, that we are going to try to keep things under control. Look what weapons we have. So, let me just keep going here a little more.
Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki.
Now, a big pet peeve of mine is recently there's been these conspiracy theories that the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki never happened, which just boggles my mind. The rationale behind this, one of the rationales anyway, is, well, take a look at places like Chernobyl. It's dead and it's going to be dead for a long, long time. People can't live there safely. And yet people moved right back into Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Clearly it wasn't nuclear. Well, there's a lot wrong with that kind of argument. And I'll just get into it really briefly here because I don't want to make this a huge sidetrack. But it is a big enough pet peeve. I've got to say something, okay? For starters, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were babies compared to what comes even soon after, let alone what kind of radiation we're talking about modern times and at events like Chernobyl. These are tiny compared to that. Second, they are aerial detonations over the city. They're not impact detonations, and there's a big difference between the two. An aerial detonation does a lot of damage, and it does do radioactive damage, obviously, but it also does a lot of concussive damage and things like that. The big thing is that it's high enough up that a lot of the radiation actually gets into the highest levels of the atmosphere and is relatively speaking harmless. I'm not going to say harmless, but compared to a ground impact, relatively harmless. Ground impacts eject ground material up into the air to a much higher scale, dust, particulates, that kind of thing, that are heavily irradiated, and the wind current will carry those around, and that stuff will settle. And that's where you get radioactive fallout that's dangerous. But depending on prevailing wind patterns and how far it's dispersed, how dangerous can be debatable. The bomb used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki left radioactive levels that were safe easily within years. Some of these early atomic detonations with low altitude detonations, the worst of the radiation was gone within months. So that's just not a good argument for why it couldn't have been a nuclear attack on these. It happened. There's more than enough witnesses. There's more than enough first-hand testimony from the Japanese, from the government involved. It happened. There's no way you can get so many people from all parts of the world on rival sides agreeing on something like this if it didn't actually happen. So sorry, conspiracy theorists. At least on this one, you have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah, later nuclear bombs that are much larger and have ground impacts can render an area unlivable for a long period of time, but that's not this. And Chernobyl definitely is not this. Chernobyl is something entirely different.
The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage.
Yeah, he did say that, and in fact, I've got a copy of that speech here, and I'll read you the full context because we're going to get into a debate here in a moment.
After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed.
MacArthur had one heck of an ego. I really do not like that man. Yeah, he did some important things, but I just cannot like him. You don't have to like your military generals, do you? I guess. Anyway, let's take a look at, there's an ongoing debate. It's been going on since the Japanese surrender, but I've seen a lot of it resurging lately online in the day of social media, so I thought we'd touch on this, and that is, why did Japan surrender? Was it the Soviet Union entering the war, or was it the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Those are the two primary things that people point at, and those are the things that they fight over the most viciously. So let's take a look at both of them. So let's put a little context first, about the Soviet Union. Up until this point, the Soviet Union had a neutrality pact with Japan. That meant that Japan's northern flanks were fairly secure. They did not have an enemy to the north. Once the Soviet Union declares war on Japan as part of their agreement with the Allies for helping with the Germans, Japan is now literally surrounded. Now they've got an enemy force ready to bear down on them from the north. So that's some context that we need to understand here right from the beginning. Up until this point, they had no threat from the Soviet Union, and their northern flanks were fairly secure. With the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, now they have a northern enemy coming in, and one that's really pissed off, I might add. Soviet Union took more casualties than any other country. They're mad, and they've kind of got some paybacks they want to dish out for the Russo-Japanese War as well. So the context there about some of that. But let's take a look at what Hirohito actually said in his radio announcement of the surrender. This was August 15th in 1945. Despite the best that had been done by everyone, the gallant fighting of the military and naval forces, the diligence and assiduity, I don't even know what that word means, assiduity of our servants of the state, I'm assuming it's a derivation of assiduous, I don't know, and the devoted service of our 100 million people, the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. That's one way of saying we're not winning anymore. While the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. So he's acknowledging that there's multiple factors in play. It's not just one thing or the other. And for me, that's something that we, especially in our current polarized political climate, we're having trouble grappling with sometimes, is history is almost never black and white. There's always a lot of nuance, there's always other things contributing. Almost always. It's so rarely can you say, this is the cause of this, or this is the result of that. There's always multiple things going on and multiple consequences. So let's continue here. Sorry. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. So here he is singling out the atomic bombs. And this is a passage that a lot of people cite, especially here in America, United States, saying, hey, it was the bombs. Hirohito said so himself. Okay, let's continue, though. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization. So, this is a passage that's often cited for the argument that the bombs were why they surrendered. And I can see why they would use this for that. But before he says the bombs, he does say it is the general trends have all turned against us. So he's saying that there is more to it than just that. But that is a big deal, no question. I don't think anybody's denying that. But there's more to this. So prior to this announcement, on August 9th in 1945, Hirohito, in an imperial conference, said, the entry of the Soviet Union into the war makes it impossible to continue the war. So prior to his announcement that the bombs caused it, he is saying that the entry of the Soviet Union has ensured that Japan will eventually lose, that it is impossible to continue the war. So we need to keep that in mind. Here's the same guy saying the Soviet involvement, declaration of war, is an important factor. Also, the Japanese foreign minister, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this name, like I'm sure I'm butchering a lot of these names, Shigenori Togo, he said, the Soviet entry into the war was a great shock to me. This meant the end of the Japanese Empire. More than the atomic bombs, it put an end to the Japanese war effort. And so, yeah, this was a recollection by the foreign minister. He's recalling how he felt. But for him, the Soviet announcement that they were entering the war was a bigger shock and a bigger issue than the bombs. So that's what the Japanese perspective was. Let's just do one more. This is from General George Marshall, who is commenting on this section of the war. The Russian entry into the war is, of course, the decisive action, but the bomb might be the thing that finishes it up. So from his perspective, or at least from what I gather from what he said there, is that the Soviet entry into war clinched it. Japan was going to surrender. Dropping the bombs just put a nail on that coffin and made it happen a little quicker, ensured that it was going to be done right away. And as they kind of implied earlier, it was as much to end the war in Japan as it was to send a signal to the Soviet Union, we've got this now. So in the post-World War, you might want to keep that in mind when you continue your expansionist tendencies. So I think there was a lot more to this than one thing or the other causing Japan to surrender. I think it was an agglomeration of factors, the two biggest being the Soviet entry into the war and the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's possible to be more than one thing, and I don't know why people have so much trouble grappling with that idea. It doesn't have to be all one or the other. It doesn't, and we don't have to say, oh, my contribution was more important than your contribution. We can just say, hey, it was both. Okay, it was both. And we can debate the fine details and maybe which one contributed more, but let's not make this an either-or scenario. It isn't. It doesn't need to be. I don't know why people get so invested in making it an either-or scenario. Anyway, okay, I'm stepping down off my soapbox now. Let's continue.
Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war.
Oh, yeah.
A very, very cold one.
And we will be doing that next. Well, not tomorrow, but my next Oversimplified, probably a week from the release of these two parts, that's my plan anyway, will be the Cold War two-parter. So we got that to look forward to. And I think we're done here because we're getting into the advertisement. I've not yet done a recent video. I don't plan to do any videos within a week of release to let the original content creators get all the views they can first. So I'm going to have a bare minimum of a week after any new video is released before I'll even consider touching it. And I'll probably wait longer than that just to really let the original content creators get their moment of glory before I step in and Shanghai the show. But older videos, I'm not going to watch the advertisement, but in newer ones, anything that's less than a year old, I will, just because I do want to support these original content creators. I do want them to get all the attention they can and they deserve from making videos like this. And I do want them to look good to their sponsors. So
Looks just
anyway, enough about that. I think we're done here. So I will see you all tomorrow for a new video. And hopefully a week from today, or a week from yesterday, we will start in on Oversimplified Cold War. So until then, see you later. Bye-bye.